Hello and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where the breaking news is that Quincy Jones has died, one of the truly great musicians of all time. He died at the age of 91, which, although he had a long and incredibly musically fulfilling life, it's always very sad to say goodbye to someone who's been part of our lives for most of our lives, and that includes me and most of the people watching this. Now, Quincy Jones could have said a lot about his life. One of the most interesting factoids, if you will, is that I cannot think of someone else in the music world who worked with Elvis, Frank Sinatra, and Michael Jackson, and who in his lifetime had his music sampled by the biggest hip hop artists of the final decade of the 20th century, including Tupac Shakur. He was someone who spanned so many genres for two reasons: his incredible compositional and arranging talent. And when you've got that, you'll never be out of demand. And the fact that he was someone who pushed boundaries and was able to react to the changing styles in music around him meant that he was never out of demand. He never felt old fashioned, even though that label could have theoretically been applied to some of his contemporaries. And I think there are two sort of musical reasons for this. One is his jazz background. He instinctively knew the jazz world. He knew what makes a composition something that you can improvise on as a soloist. What are the chords that jazzers would find interesting? He implicitly knew that from experience, from his days as a performance artist, as a trumpeter. And so he approached composition from the point of view of someone who had been a professional performer in his youth. I think some of it also his formal study of composition in Paris, including under the modern French composer Oliver Messiaen. And I think that when you combine those two things together, you get such a rich style of composition and arrangement that melds the most modern textures and flavors of jazz, if you will, with compositional approaches that really understands how you can play with harmony and manipulate harmony to really get at you emotionally, but subtly at the same time. Because that's another thing about his compositions and his arrangements. There was something very direct about the emotions that were conveyed by the music, but there was also a subtlety that made them easy on the ears and the mind. Very difficult to pinpoint, but it was something that ran through all of his compositions and all of his arrangements. Of course, with Sinatra, he did several very well regarded albums. It might as well be Swing with Count Basie was the first time that they worked together. Quincy did all of the arrangements for that, and that was considered a great album on the reprise side of Sinatra's career, which is actually my favorite. My favorite Sinatra albums are, in fact, his reprise albums. And Quincy also did My Kind of Broadway, which had a lot of familiar hits with a fresh arrangement by Quincy. Really wonderful stuff. And of course, Quincy was the band leader on the Sinatra at the Sands album, the first official live album that Sinatra released. And again, live albums were sometimes seen as throwaway, but not when Sinatra did it. And Quincy Jones is a big reason for that. Now, in the early 1980s, Sinatra's last sort of fully fledged, if you will, solo album, studio album was released. And this is LA is My Lady, which in many ways is his swan song. And this, of course, brought Sinatra and Quincy Jones back together. And certainly on the title track, it really brought Sinatra's sound into the 80s because while Sinatra was someone who I think it's been exaggerated, but they say he was a bit reticent to change. I think he very much embraced contemporary trends in music, especially beginning in the late 60s. But we all know that when we think of arrangements for Frank Sinatra, you think of either big band, string orchestra, jazz combo. But Quincy, who had earned Sinatra's respect because he produced hit albums for him, he made the track "LA Is My Lady" in the style of a modern R&B derived pop song of the 80s. And it really worked. And the music video had many cameos from so many people: Dean Martin, Donna Summer, Eddie Van Halen, and David Lee Roth. So the whole thing really brought Eddie, brought Quincy, not brought, it brought Frank. See so many celebrities into the 80s. Of course, the person that Quincy Jones is probably most associated with is Michael Jackson because he produced and contributed to the composition process on Michael Jackson's most famous and most beloved albums, including Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad. Thriller being one of the most laureled and beloved and awarded albums of all time. And that album's production, again, while it was very much of its time, the level of detail, the level of clarity, the sonic balance put into it, the timelessness of the composition, something that, of course, is owed to Michael, but also Quincy, it just created an album that will always live in the minds of everyone. Of course, the 70s was an incredibly fruitful period, especially for Quincy's solo albums. Smackwater Jack from 1971, wonderful, wonderful album. You Got It Bad Girl from the following year. Great, great album. Body Heat from 74, an all-time classic. The title track, like I said, sampled later on by Tupac. And it was here where, and throughout these 70s albums, we worked with so many of the musicians that you would come to know and collaborate with on other projects. Herbie Hancock was on the Body Heat album. Bob James was on the album. David Grusin was on the album. One of my favorites, Hubert Laws, was on the album. Billy Preston, the great Billy Preston, on the organ. Leon Ware, who's a star in his own right, provided vocals, as did the wonderful Minnie Riperton, Al Jarreau. The list goes on. And this is true with all of his albums from that period. And of course, you can't forget the Dude from 1981, which in many ways is an album that was symptomatic of the transition between 70s Quincy Jones and 80s Quincy Jones. If you want to know the sort of arrangement and production style background to Thriller, you should listen not necessarily to Off the Wall, which of course was a Quincy Jones production, but to Quincy's 81 album, The Dude, because it was the stylistic sort of experiments that he was doing on that highly regarded album that really give you a clear indication of what was to come with Thriller. So definitely check that out. Um, it's of course sad that we've lost him, but he's one of these musicians that will definitely live on because there is so much, and he pops up everywhere because he had such a prolific career. I mean, Soul Bossa Nova became the Austin Powers theme 35 years later. He had no idea that it would be used for a comedy film, but there you go. Hence the timelessness of all of his compositions. He was a living legend. I mean, I would say that even in the era that he worked with Michael Jackson, he was already considered a living legend, having worked with so many people. Elvis, like I said, Frank Sinatra, just about so many of these major, major stars. Herbie Hancock had a great relationship with, as I mentioned. So rest in peace, Quincy Jones. It was an amazing musical journey you took us on, and I have zero doubt that not just some, but most of the music you brought us will live on forever. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.